Summer 2008, Gangwon Island, South Korea. In a normally quiet village, a mother and daughter suddenly disappeared. Mother Yoon Bok Fei-hee, 47. Daughter Kim Sundae Fei-yang, 16. They lived a simple life, farmed ginseng, took care of the family, kept normal relations with neighbors. The day they vanished, family members called the police immediately. Initially, police thought this might just be a routine missing persons case. Maybe the two had left temporarily. Maybe they had an accident. But as the investigation deepened, police found something they couldn't explain. The last person the family had contact with was not a stranger. It was someone they had trusted for a long time. In the village, everyone knew this young man. Some called him a friend. Some treated him like family. Even the victim's daughter affectionately called him Oppa Fei older brother. But police later discovered that this so Fei called good brother was not the one protecting the family. He was the one who had been slowly getting close to them, watching their lives, and ultimately using that trust. What made it even more shocking? This case wasn't a simple robbery. As the investigation moved forward, police found that a large sum of cash, a missing mother and daughter, a seemingly ordinary neighbor, and an old unsolved case from years ago all began to connect. So what did this man, trusted by everyone, actually do? Why did a mother and her 16-year-old daughter become his targets? And how many secrets were hidden in the truth the police finally uncovered? This is the Gangwon Island mother-daughter disappearance case, a story of trust, betrayal, and the danger that hides in plain sight. A mother and daughter. Vanish June 2008. Gangwon Island, South Korea. Far from the city's noise, most residents knew each other. Neighbors helped one another. In a place like this, people rarely thought that danger might come from someone familiar. Yoon Bok Fei-hee, 47, and her 16-year-old daughter, Kim Sundae Fei-yang, were an ordinary mother and daughter living here. Yoon's husband had died years earlier. After that, she alone shouldered the responsibility of caring for the family. She worked ginseng fields, busy every day, trying to give her daughter a better life. Her daughter, Kim Sundae Fei-yang, was a high school student. At school, she did well. Quiet by nature, she loved writing and dreamed of becoming a screenwriter one day. In the eyes of the neighbors, this family was nothing special. No obvious conflicts, no unusual signs. They were just like many ordinary families, living a peaceful life. But after the 18th of June 2008, everything changed. That day, both mother and daughter lost contact at the same time. Phone calls went unanswered. No clear message was left at home. At first, the family didn't think it was serious. Adults sometimes leave, phones die, or they're temporarily unreachable. Fate that's not unusual. But as time passed, unease grew because this time it wasn't one person missing. It was a mother and her 16-year-old daughter. After confirming they couldn't reach them, the family finally called the police. Police responded and began investigating it as a missing persons case. Initially, it looked like a routine disappearance. Police needed to find out, had they left on their own? Had they met with an accident? Had someone forced them away? Investigators first looked into the mother and daughter's daily lives. They found that their routine was very regular, no sudden moving plans, no preparations for a long trip, and no clear indication they wanted to leave. More importantly, the daughter had regular school obligations the next day. That meant she hadn't planned to leave her life behind. Police began to realize this might not be a simple runaway. At the same time, investigators uncovered a key issue. Before the disappearance, someone had been in close contact with them. That person was not a stranger. They had known him for a long time. In most people's memory, this man didn't seem dangerous. He was young, willing to help others, and often around the mother and daughter's daily life. Even the daughter had trusted him like an older brother. This was the most puzzling part of the case. If a stranger had approached the victims, police could easily look for motive, for leads, for connections. But if the danger came from someone they trusted, the situation was completely different. Bakers. Trust lowers guard, familiarity hides abnormality, and an ordinary looking person may be closer to the target than any stranger. As the investigation went on, police began to re-examine every detail surrounding the disappearance. They wanted to know Who was the last person to see them? Who was the last person to contact them? And who might know what happened after they vanished? That question, in the end, would point the investigation in a direction no one had expected. Vertical bar, the last call before disappearance. As police investigated the mother-Faye-daughter disappearance, own key detail gradually emerged. Kim Sunday Fae-young had not disappeared before school that day. In fact, she had arrived at school normally. According to her teacher, that morning, Kim Sunday Fae-young walked into class as usual, showing no sign of anything unusual, and didn't tell anyone she had a problem. But then, around 11:30 a.m., something strange happened. While in class, her phone suddenly rang. The caller was her mother, Yoon Bok-fae-hee. That alone wasn't unusual, Faye. Mother calling her daughter is normal in any family. The problem was, when the call connected, the voice on the other end wasn't Yoon Bok-fae-hee, it was an unknown male. He told Kim Sunday Fae-young, "Your mother needs to take care of something. Come out now." Faced with this sudden request, Kim Sunday Fae-young didn't agree immediately. Fae-shi was in the middle of an exam at school. She refused to leave, saying she needed to finish class. Then the phone was handed back to Yoon Bok-fae-hee. This time, her mother personally urged her to leave school. She told her daughter, "Mom really has something important. Come out first, you can make up the class later." On the surface, it sounded like a mother with an emergency, asking her daughter to come quickly. But when police later reviewed the call, they spotted a critical red flag. Why would a girl who was in school, in the middle of class, be suddenly asked to leave? And the person making the request wasn't a teacher or a family relative. Faye was an unknown male. In the end, after her mother's repeated urging, Kim Sunday Fae-young left school. Around 12:30 p.m., she left campus early. But from that moment on, she never returned. The next day, her teacher noticed she hadn't come to school and tried to contact both mother and daughter. No one answered. Based on the teacher's information, police shifted their focus. This clue proved that the disappearance didn't happen on the way to school. It happened after she had already arrived. In other words, someone had called her out of school after she was already there. Investigators began tracing the movements of both mother and daughter that day. They checked bank records, credit card usage, and surveillance footage. Soon, police found an even more important piece of information. Shortly after Kim Sunday Fae-young left school, her mother, Yoon Bok-fae-hee, went to the bank and withdrew a huge amount of cash. 100 million Korean won. For police, this became the second major red flag. An ordinary missing Fae person's case usually doesn't involve a large cash transaction. Even stranger, Yoon Bok-fae-hee wasn't alone. When she withdrew the money, bank staff recalled that two young men accompanied her Fae-young waiting in the car, the other helping carry the cash. Throughout the entire process, Yoon Bok-fae-hee appeared completely normal, even chatting briefly with the staff. That meant she didn't seem terrified at the time, nor did she appear to be forced into the bank. Then the question arose, if she was kidnapped, why would she willingly withdraw the money? If she acted voluntarily, why did she completely disappear afterward? Police began to realize that behind this case might lie a far more complex plan, and those two young men who accompanied her to the bank became the next focus of the investigation. As the investigation deepened, police reanalyzed everything that happened on the day of the disappearance. One detail increasingly caught their attention: the 100 million won in cash. Police found that Yoon Bok-fae-hee had withdrawn that money from her bank account Fae-hand. It wasn't ordinary savings. It was life insurance money she had received after her husband died. After her husband's death, that money became the family's main financial support. To police, that opened up a new possibility: was the disappearance tied to that large cash sum? In many crimes, money is often the most direct motive, especially when a victim suddenly acquires a large amount of cash. They become an easier target. Police began to investigate. Who knew about the money? Who knew when Yoon Bok-fae-hee would withdraw it? And who knew her daily habits? During the investigation, police discovered something unusual. Although Yoon Bok-fae-hee had a decent amount of assets, she wasn't someone who flaunted her wealth. Villagers recalled that she lived simply, didn't buy expensive things, but because of the insurance payout after her husband's death, her financial situation gradually became known to people around her. More alarmingly, after her husband died, her home had been burglarized multiple times. Yoon didn't report it to the police. Instead, she installed security cameras at her door hoping to protect her property. That suggested her wealth had already drawn attention from some people. Police then looked into her personal relationships, trying to find anyone who might know her financial status. Soon, a name entered their sights: Faye, woman with the last name Kim. This woman was not a long Fae-time local of Gangwon Island. She had moved there a few years earlier. She got to know Yoon Bok Fae, and their relationship grew closer over time. At first, she was just a regular neighbor. But later, the relationship changed. After Yoon's husband died, she often reached out to Yoon Fae, chatting with her, inviting her to activities, even offering emotional support. For Yoon, who had just lost her husband, that period was very vulnerable. She had lost her main pillar of support. Her son was serving in the military, and her daughter became her greatest emotional anchor. Just then, the Kim woman began introducing her to a new belief system, and gradually influenced her life. Police discovered that this woman not only had frequent contact with Yoon, but also showed clear interest in her financial situation. She had even offered to help manage her money. That raised police suspicion. Why would a mere friend be so interested in someone else's savings? How did she know so much about her finances? Further investigation revealed that on the day of the incident, Yoon Bok Fae had contacted this woman as well. Faye, not just her daughter. Even stranger, the next day, this woman proactively asked the bank whether Yoon had withdrawn cash. Why would someone unrelated to the case care about the missing mother's withdrawal? That question made police readjust their investigation. They began to suspect that this case might not be a simple cash robbery fee, because if the criminals were only after money, why involve Yoon's daughter? Why pull a 16-year failed girl out of school? And why take the risk of being recognized by the victims? Just as police were preparing to dig deeper into this lead, the case took a new turn, because they found that the person truly close to this family might be more than one, and hidden behind the mother-daughter disappearance might be a group that had been watching them for a long time. As the investigation deepened, police found that all the seemingly scattered clues began pointing in the same direction. This case might not have been committed by a stranger. It came from someone close to the victims. Police re-examined Yoon Bok Fae and her daughter's social circle. They discovered that a young man had been consistently hanging around the family. His name was On Won Feel in the village. On Won Feel was no stranger. On the contrary, he was very close to Yoon's family because of the age difference. Kim Sundae Fae even called him Oppa Fae, older brother. In many villagers' eyes, An was a reliable young man. He offered help to neighbors, and he kept in touch with the family often. But police investigation revealed that it was exactly this long standing trust that gave him access to the family. He knew Yoon's daily routine, when she took her daughter to school and when the house might be empty. More importantly, he knew that after Yoon's husband died, she had received a large insurance payout. Police began tracing An's movements. Soon they found on the day of the incident, an unfamiliar vehicle had appeared near the village. A villager provided a key lead. He said he'd seen a Hyundai Sonata near the village entrance that didn't belong there. He remembered the license plate. Police traced the plate and found the owner Fayan Won Fail. Investigators then analyzed his phone records and found an even more critical detail. On the day of the crime, An had been inside Yoon's home and made a call to check on information about Sunday Faeyang's school. That action seemed ordinary, but in the context of the whole case, it became important evidence, because police now suspected that he not only knew the family, but had also gathered information about the daughter's school in advance. Police then tracked An's location and arrested him in Ansan, South Korea. The interrogation lasted late into the night. Faced with mounting evidence, An's psychological defenses began to crumble. Eventually, he gave police more information. He said he hadn't acted alone. There were others involved. Based on his information, police quickly launched more arrests. Within a short time, 3 other suspects were also taken into custody. At this point, police confirmed that this wasn't a solo crime. It was a planned operation. The relationships among the 4 suspects gradually became clear. On one Fei responsible for providing target intelligence, using his relationship with the victim's family to learn their habits. Young Fei identified by police as the main planner. Lee Myung Fei responsible for accompanying Yoonbok Fei to the bank. Yeon Jae Fei mainly handled logistical support. Police were finally able to reconstruct the broad structure of the crime. They chose a target Fei not random, but a family they had long observed. And their weapon wasn't the violence of strangers. Fei was the thing most easily overlooked among acquaintances. The victims trusted them, so they let their guard down, and that very trust ultimately became the opportunity the criminals exploited. The case had reached the point where the main suspects were caught, but an even more chilling question emerged. Why did these people choose this family? How long had they been planning this? And who first came up with the idea? As police continued to dig, a darker truth began to surface. After the 4 suspects were arrested, the case finally entered the phase of uncovering the truth. As the investigation proceeded, police found that this was not a crime was a carefully prepared scheme. According to the suspects' statements, about 2 months before the incident, they had already started discussing ways to get money. Their target was clear: Yoonbok Fei. The reason was simple. She had just lost her husband and received a large insurance payout. For the criminals, that money became their target. But the problem was, they weren't unfamiliar with the family Fei. On the contrary, they knew them well, and that's why they chose them. One Fei had lived nearby for a long time. He knew the family situation, Yoon's daily routines, and the relationship between mother and daughter. He knew that every morning, Yoon would take her daughter to school, and afterwards, the house was usually left with only an elderly person. That information allowed the plan to take shape. They began to observe in advance, look for the right time, prepare a vehicle, and plan their approach. Police discovered that to reduce the risk of being identified, An even changed his car, Fei buying a used vehicle. Originally, they had planned to act one day earlier, but that day something went wrong. Yoon's mother Fei and Fei-la didn't leave the house as usual. If they went ahead, they might be discovered. So they changed the plan and waited for the next opportunity. On the day of the incident, they executed the plan. They first subdued Yoonbok Fei, then demanded that she cooperate in withdrawing the money. To make her believe she still had a chance to survive, the criminals told her, "Just get the money and you and your daughter will be safe." That was the most brutal part of the case. They weren't exploiting the fear of a stranger Fei. They were exploiting the trust the victims had placed in them. Yoon believed that if she followed their instructions, she and her daughter would walk away alive. So she called her daughter and asked Sunday, Fei Niang, to leave school early, but she didn't know that call wasn't protecting her daughter. Fayette was leading her into danger. After that, the group split into 2 teams. Feon took Yoon to the bank. The other went to pick up Sunday Feiyang. Bank staff later recalled that Yoon appeared calm that day. She showed no obvious fear, nor did she raise any suspicion Fei because, until that point, she probably still believed that these men only wanted money and would let them go afterward. But the criminals had never intended to keep their promise. What they truly feared was if the mother and daughter were released, their identities would be exposed. Fei, since An was so closely connected to the family, police would soon track them down. So to cover up the crime, they made an irreversible choice. Afterward, the suspects split the stolen cash and fled separately. However, they hadn't anticipated that their carefully planned crime would leave behind countless traces fought the vehicle call records, witness testimony, and the information they exchanged with each other. Eventually, these fragments pieced together the full truth. On the surface, it was a crime planned for money. But investigators later found that what truly drove it all was not just greed Fei but a complete disregard for human life. They thought that, with enough planning, they could escape punishment, but they never expected that the trust they had exploited would ultimately become the very clue that led police straight to them. After the 4 suspects were arrested, the case seemed close to being fully resolved. Police believed that they only needed to confirm the details of the crime and then await the court's judgment. But during the investigation, an unexpected development occurred. To reduce their own culpability, the 4 suspects began turning on each other. Each tried to prove that they were not the mastermind Feidat. They had only been influenced by others. Among them, the conflict between Ha Young Feimyung and An Wonfeil grew increasingly obvious. Ha insisted that the real driving force behind the entire case was actually An And. An, to support his own version, provided police with a new lead fan old case from years earlier. He said that Ha Young Feimyung had also been involved in a missing fit-person case involving a relative. That information prompted police to reopen an investigation file that had lain dormant for years. Years earlier, Ha Young Feimyung's half-phase sister, Ha So-fei, had suddenly disappeared. At the time, the family immediately reported it to the police, hoping they would find her. A few days later, the family received a ransom call demanding payment. Back then, Ha So-fei's father had already suspected that Ha Young Feimyung might be involved because there had been conflicts between them. However, the investigation at the time failed to find enough evidence no body, no direct physical evidence, and no way to prove Ha Young Feimyung's involvement. Eventually, the case was treated as a routine disappearance. Years passed, and no one knew the truth. Until the Ganghwa Island mother-daughter case occurred. That long hidden secret was brought back into the light based on the information Am provided. Paula started looking for new evidence. Investigators went to relevant locations and conducted searches. Eventually, they found important clues related to Ha So-fei's disappearance. Faced with the new evidence, Ha Young Feimyung finally admitted to the old crime. Police confirmed that this was not his first offense. As the investigation continued, police also discovered that in the past few years, these suspects had used threats and deception to extort money from others. That meant the Ganghwa Island mother-daughter case was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern of criminal behavior carried out by this group over time. For police, that finding changed the nature of the case. They were no longer dealing with just one robbery homicide. They were dealing with individuals who had repeatedly crossed legal and moral lines. Among them, Ha Young Feimyung became the focus of the investigation. From the Ganghwa case to the old relative disappearance to other crimes, all the threads began to connect. A clearer picture gradually emerged. These people didn't become criminals. Because of one conflict, they had gradually crossed the line over a series of bad choices. And the most shocking part was that some of their victims had once trusted them, even considered them close. After all 4 suspects were in custody, the case officially moved into the judicial process. For police, the chain of evidence was now largely complete. They confirmed that the 4 had formulated a plan in advance, used their relationships with the victims to get close, and committed the crime for money. Prosecutors argued that this was not an accidental conflict was a premeditated criminal operation, because before the act, they had observed the victim's family situation, learned their daily routines, prepared a vehicle, and assigned different people to different tasks. These actions proved the case had clear planning. During the trial, the 4 defendants tried to downplay their own responsibility. Ha Young Feimyung and An Wonfeil both attempted to prove that they weren't the main instigators. They began pointing fingers at each other, trying to shift more blame onto the other. But the court held that no matter who initiated the plan, all 4 had participated in the entire process and together they had caused an irreversible tragedy. Among them, Ha Young Feimyung was deemed to have played a leading role. Prosecutors pointed out that he had not only been involved in the Ganghwa case, but also in the older, concealed crime. Therefore, they demanded the harshest punishment for him. The first trial court ultimately issued its verdict. Ha Young Feimyung was sentenced to death. An Wonfeil and Lee Myung-feung received life imprisonment. Eum Jae-feil, because of his lesser involvement, was given a fixed prison term. This verdict drew widespread attention in South Korean society. Many believe that such a crime, which caused irreparable harm, deserved the harshest possible punishment. But after that, the outcome changed again. During the appeal process, the court reconsidered some factors, including the defendants' upbringing, their attitude after the crime, and their potential for rehabilitation. In the end, the higher court overturned Ha Young Feimyung's death sentence, commuting it to life in prison. That decision immediately sparked controversy. Many victims' families could not accept the outcome because for them, the pain of losing their loved ones could never be undone. Especially for Yu Bokfei's son Feihe had hoped that after completing his military service, his family would reunite. Instead, he was met with the news that his mother and sister were gone forever. This case also triggered a broader debate in Korean society about sentencing policy. One question kept being asked: for those who cause grave harm, how should the law balance punishment and rehabilitation? That's not just an issue for one case. It's a question many judicial systems face. The case eventually reached the end of its legal proceedings. But for the victims' families, a true ending may never come. The 2008 Gangwon Island mother-daughter case eventually, with the court's ruling, entered the final stage of legal process. But for many, what this case left behind was not just a criminal verdict. It was a far more unsettling question. Why would an ordinary mother and daughter become the targets of criminals? The answer wasn't because they had contact with strangers. Quite the opposite. It was precisely because they knew these people and trusted them that they lowered their guard. On one faith, the young man once trusted by the victim's family, Faye used the long standing neighborly relationship. He knew the family's habits when they were alone and that they wouldn't easily suspect him. And Young Faye Myung, driven by money, pointed his crime at a family that never should have been hurt. That's the most chilling part of this case. The criminals didn't suddenly appear in the victims' lives as strangers. They were already there, even treated as friends, even treated like family. In many criminal cases, people's first instinct is to think that danger comes from outside, from unfamiliar environments, from strangers. But the Gangwon case reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger may come from those who are easiest to trust. This case also made many people rethink how trust between people should be built. Kindness is not wrong, helping others is not wrong, but in the real world, knowing what someone truly thinks will always be more important than knowing their surface behavior. The Gangwon Island mother-daughter case ultimately leaves behind not a simple crime story. It's a tragedy of greed, of deception, and of trust being weaponized. A young girl, a mother who worked hard to live after losing her husband. They only wanted to live an ordinary life, but because they trusted the wrong people, their lives ended forever that summer. And those who once pretended to be friends must also pay for their choices. What is truly frightening is never the traces left after a crime. It's that before the crime even happens, danger may already be hiding among the people you know best. This is the Korean Gangwon Island mother-daughter case. A story about trust, betrayal, and the danger that hides within the crowd.